You may have heard it said before that Christians and non-Christians have the same levels of abuse rates and divorce rates. That's not entirely true. Did you know there's a difference between a committed Christian and a nominal Christian? We call those people who sit on the fence the nominal Christians. Christian men, committed Christian men, have some of the lowest divorce rates and lowest abuse rates in society. Nominal Christians, the fence sitters, are some of the worst people in our society and in our culture. In this episode of In Between Sundays, I talked to Nancy Pearcey, author of the book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, as we dig into this and so much more about masculinity in our world. Welcome to In Between Sundays. Well, Professor Pearcey, thank you so much for joining me and having this conversation specifically around your book. This has been a transformational book. I'm just going to say from the very beginning, y'all need to go get this book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. What I've loved about this book, Nancy, is just your ability to take social sciences and our faith and bring those together in a really accessible way. So thank you for the book, but also thank you for joining me in this conversation.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So this is I do want to jump right in because I think this is such good information. I'm curious though, when you came up with this idea to write a book called The Toxic War on Masculinity, what was it that made you want to write about this topic?
You know, I was just so shocked at how acceptable it's become to be hostile against men in our society. I'll tell you the one article that really caught my eye. It was in the Washington Post, and it was titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And I thought, really, in a mainstream publication? And the Huffington Post, an editor tweeted, #KillAllMen. And then said it was just a joke. And speaking of jokes, you can buy T-shirts that say "so many men, so little ammunition." So, you know, what really caught my eye was the entire books called "No Good Men" or "I Hate Men" or "Are Men Necessary?" That was a New York Times columnist.
Yeah.
What's really sad though is even some men have jumped on that bandwagon. There's a male book author who wrote, "Talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer." And then this one you may have seen. It came out after my book, but it was in the news. The director of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So this is what I wanted to respond to. I wanted to say, where is this coming from? You know, you cannot really stand against a social trend unless you know where did it come from and how did it develop.
Yeah, absolutely. So can we dig into just this phrase toxic masculinity? Because I think it's been used in so many different ways, in so many unhealthy ways, that many things have been labeled toxic masculinity, where they're just kind of attributes of being a man many times. So I'm curious from your perspective, if you could help us understand, what do you mean when you talk toxic masculinity? Where did that phrase come from and how has it been blown out of proportion?
Well, you notice that my title intentionally avoided using the phrase
Right.
because I did not want to say there was such a thing as toxic masculinity. And so I did the sort of turn of phrase, the toxic war on masculinity. Yeah. But the idea that masculinity is toxic has a much longer history than most people realize. And this is part of what's unique about my book, is that it turns out most people think, I certainly did, it was 1960s second wave feminism where this term developed. But actually, it goes all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. You see just as hostile language used in the 19th century as you see today. And the reason for that was basically before the Industrial Revolution, most men worked on the family farm, the family industry, the family business, alongside their wives and children all day. Yeah. And so the cultural expectation on men focused much more on their caretaking role. You know, they were responsible for their family. They didn't work for, you know, self-advancement and achievement. They worked to support their family. And so even secular textbooks, like there was a history book that I researched, and it said the concept of masculine virtue was duty to God and man. I thought, whoa, where did we lose that? So the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into offices and factories. And instead of working with people they loved all day and had a moral bond with, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. That's a very different work environment. And that's when you see the literature change. People begin to protest that men were changing, that they were losing their caretaking ethos, that they were becoming self-interested and aggressive and greedy and acquisitive, to use the 19th century language, and even turning their career into an idol. I was astonished at how often I saw that language used, that men, instead of living for their family and their church, they were living for career success. And that was a new thing. And so we have to recognize this is when it happened, is when men got, in a sense, separated from their families. And of course, that suggests what the solution is how can we reintegrate men more into their families more closely.
Yeah, and you talk a lot in your book about the importance of men prioritizing their family, prioritizing the roles as a father and a husband. What do you think that men are doing that helps facilitate or exacerbate this idea of toxic masculinity?
Well, I'll answer that historically again, because one of the main places we see men accused of being toxic is fathers. Right? Fathers are always the butt of the joke. Fathers are always the bumbling idiot. I don't know what shows your kids watched, but one of my sons loved the Berenstain Bears. And, that was a supreme example where the father's always the dumb one. Even the kids are smarter. So where did that come from? Again, it's the Industrial Revolution, because when men started being out of the home all day, they were not as much in touch with their kids' feelings, their kids' thoughts, their kids' experiences. And again, you see it already in the 19th century. The writing, we're so used to it, but the writing at the time was traumatic. They felt like the family had been just hollowed out. I have some quotes in the book where people at the time would say things like, the father is the mainstay of the family, and yet he cannot hardly even live with them, because he comes home only at night. Or the most influential woman of the 19th century was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And here's how she put it. She said, God is the prototype, for the father. And yet the prototype of the divine is gone from the family from Sunday to Sunday. So again, a part of it is sensitizing ourselves to the fact that this is not normal. Right? The Industrial Revolution is after millennia of human history where men did work with their families all day. And so we have to understand that this is a very unusual, this is atypical, for human experience. And how can we reconnect fathers with their families again?
Yeah, and there's a statistic that you talk about, and I'd love for you to dig into this a little bit more about if you could just walk us through the difference between a committed Christian man and a nominal Christian man and the impact that we see between those two groups.
Yeah, this was actually the final reason I decided to write this book, is I kind of stumbled on this research that has been done on evangelical men. Evangelical men have been targeted, right? They have often been targeted as, exhibit A of toxic masculinity. And I have a whole page of quotes, but I'll just give you one. This was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today.
Wow.
And so what happened is the social scientists were listening to this and saying, well, where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And so they actually went out and did the studies. I quote about a dozen studies in the book. And what they discovered is that when Christian men actually are committed, authentic, attend church regularly, they do test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. In fact, let me break it down. They interview the wives separately. I'm always asked that. So yes, they do interview the wives separately. So the wives of evangelical men report the highest level of happiness with the way their husbands treat them. Evangelical fathers spend more time with their children, 3.5 hours more per week than secular men. Evangelical couples have the lowest rate of divorce, 35% lower than secular couples. And then the real surprise is that they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. And I'll give you a quote on this because that kind of crystallizes it. The social scientist who did the biggest study was Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature, he writes in places like the New York Times. So in the New York Times, he said, and this is a direct quote, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages." And so this is not a pep talk from a religious leader. This is solid empirical research. These are solid facts that we should be bringing into our churches to start with, and then into the public square. Because if you look at my endnotes, they're all academic journal articles.
Yeah.
This information is not out in the churches yet. And I would love to see churches start encouraging men who are doing well, that in fact, following God's design does give them better marriages and happier families.
Yeah. And that's one of the things, Nancy, that I love about your approach is that it brings all those social sciences and all that research is outside of the church world to show you exactly what Scripture's pointed to the entire time works. And it actually changes lives and families. You talk about these two different scripts for masculinity. Could you elaborate on those? Kind of walk us through what those two scripts are and how they compete?
Yes, but I realized it didn't answer your earlier question because you asked me about the committed Christians versus the nominal Christians.
Yes, I did.
So we need to do that because I always get pushback on this data, right? Because people always say, well, haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture? And in fact, what I read was that's the most widely quoted statistic among religious leaders today. So the social scientists did go back to the data and they made that crucial distinction that you mentioned, which was committed, authentic, church-going Christian men versus nominal men. My students don't even know what the word nominal means. So I have to explain to them NOM is Latin for name. So it means in name only. So these are men who, on a large survey like this, might check, say, the Baptist box, for example, but who attend church rarely, if at all. And they test out dramatically different. Their wives test out as having the lowest level of happiness in their marriage. They actually spend the least amount of time with their kids. They divorce at a higher rate than secular couples, 20% higher than secular couples. And the real shocker is that they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. So I'll quote Brad Wilcox again. In an article for Christianity Today, he said, the most violent husbands in America are nominal evangelical Protestant men. And so this is a challenge for the church today, I would think. The numbers are skewed. If you just look at evangelicals, the numbers are skewed because you get men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. So how can the church find a way to disciple and encourage the men who are doing well? And how can we reach out more effectively to these men who are identifying as evangelical, but who are actually taking their concepts of masculinity from the secular world and not from the Bible?
Yeah, thank you for circling back to that. I think you said it in the book that nominal Christians are around just long enough to hear the ideas of submission and headship, but not around long enough to understand what that means. I believe those were your words and not a quote from someone else. But I think that's the piece that really lands it and like really makes it accessible. Like, hey, like we hear certain things about what it means to be a biblical man, but we haven't really discovered what that means when we're a nominal Christian. So there's this incongruence, if you will, between what they're beginning to hear and what they're actually living out. And I think you're right. It could be transformational for the church as a whole if men would commit themselves to their faith and lean into that. Let's circle back to those scripts. Walk us through the two different scripts that you talk about in the book and help us to understand how those maybe clash in our society.
Yeah, I put this study, the two scripts are from a study done by a sociologist, and I put it at the beginning of the book. And the reason I did that is because this book has been more controversial than any other book I've written, which was surprising to me because my last book, Love Thy Body, was on abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
to my surprise,
Yeah, that surprises me too.
masculinity is more of a trigger word. And in fact, when I write my books, I always have a lot of reading groups to get feedback, to rub off the rough edges. And when they told their family and friends they were going through a manuscript on masculinity, invariably the first question was, whose side is she on? The assumption you had to be on one side or the other. And so I had to rewrite the first chapter multiple times to get over that initial hesitancy or suspicion. And this study is what did it. So this is a study done by, he's not a Christian, he's a sociologist, but he speaks all around the world. And so he came up with an ingenious experiment. He would ask young men 2 questions. First, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man. What does that mean? And he said all around the world, young men had no trouble answering that question. They would immediately start listing things like honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a protector, be a provider, be responsible. Mm-hmm. And I thought, this is great. This was global, so it was not necessarily countries with any Christian background. This is just men are made in God's image, and they do know what it means.
Right.
To be good, to use their masculine strengths, not just to get what they want, but to love, provide, protect those that they care for. But then he would follow up with a second question. This was so interesting because he would ask young men, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men themselves would say, oh, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, never show weakness, play through pain, never give up, win at all costs, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. And this sociologist said, it looks like men are being sort of trapped between 2 competing scripts. They do know what the good man is. That script, that's innate, that's universal, that's built in because it's the image of God. But in many cultures, they feel pressured to live up to the real man, quote unquote, which is very different. Not that all of those traits are bad. We want people who can hang tough in a crisis. But certainly if it's disconnected from a moral vision, it can slide into dominance, entitlement, control, and so on. And so I put this at the front of the book because it helps people realize you're not just, it's not whose side are you on. You're not just for or against masculinity. You're for God-given masculinity. You're for the way God created men. But you can think critically about the way the secular world has created a script for masculinity, which is often very different. I use the metaphor of the software and the virus. The software is how God made us, but the virus is what can infect us. And we need to help young men think critically about the difference. I'll say one young man in particular, because I just got an email from one of my graduate students, and she now teaches at a high school. And she said, all my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're even using Andrew Tate quotations in the yearbook. I said, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school. Mm-hmm. So even young Christian men are, if we're not giving them a healthy biblical view of masculinity, they will be drawn in by the secular messages about what masculinity is.
Yeah, there's a lot of personality assessments that you can take that will basically show you like this is what you need, and then also shows you when you're not getting what you need, how you act out to get that thing. And that sounds a lot like what we see, and like we run because we're not getting the best way to say it, the opportunity to be the man that we're created to be. We end up running to a Tate kind of ideology that's not healthy either. We just had a few weeks ago, we were at the park with my family. I've got 3 kids. 2 of them are teenagers. One of them is an 11-year-old little girl. And my son, who's 16, was pushing my daughter and some other kids on this merry-go-round structure. And he was starting to get tired because he'd been doing it for a while, right? And my daughter said, come on, push us. And she says, be a man. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I sat there like, where did that come from? Like, that's not, we don't talk like that at home. And the reality is that stuff just will seep in from all over the place. So I'm curious, because a lot of people that are going to watch or listen to this, they're going to have kids at home. How would you advise parents to lead their family toward the healthy script, the right view of masculinity and manhood, when culture is obviously saying some other things?
That's another thing I had to answer right in the first chapter of the book, because as soon as you start talking about this, people say, well, what do you think then is a biblical view of manhood? And I start with just the physical, because that's the most non-negotiable, right? Is that men are bigger, stronger, faster.
Yeah.
75% greater upper body muscle mass, 90% greater upper body strength. They have more fast twitch muscles, which means they can react more quickly. And of course, because of testosterone, they are in general more risk-taking and more aggressive. And we have to start there by just saying, these are good. These are the creational givens. And it is a lot of these traits that do get labeled toxic. And so we have to stand against the culture and say, no, this is how God made men. And that's a good thing. And by the way, it's also good for women and children, because if men were not bigger and stronger, they couldn't protect them. So I think that just changing the assessment of these really basic physical characteristics is a good starting point.
Yeah. So can we dig? You just made a statement about how this is also good for women and children. I would love to just hear you talk a little bit more about why. Because here's some of the pushback that I've heard, just as we lean into talking about that as a church, is why are we talking about men and not women? And what we've been trying to communicate is that no, this is a win for everybody. When men get off the fence, everybody wins. But I would love to hear from you why you believe that to be true.
Well, let me just start by saying we do need to focus on men, because men are in trouble today. Boys are falling behind at every level of education. It starts in kindergarten because they don't have as good fine motor control and they can't use the scissors as well. So already in kindergarten, they're starting to feel like they're falling behind. And books have come out with titles like Why Boys Fail and The Trouble with Boys and The War Against Boys. And all the way up through high school. And then in college, I didn't know this before, but colleges now average 60% female students and only 40% male. And by the way, I teach at a small Christian college, Houston Christian. And when I arrived here, we were 70-30, 70% female. And by the way, we have consciously addressed that by two things. We started a football team.
Yeah. Good.
And we started an engineering school.
Good.
Trying to attract more male students.
Yeah. Both of those would work.
Even places like Harvard are quietly establishing affirmative action for male students now, because they know if men don't come, pretty soon the women won't come either. They're going to lose their female students. So, but then, of course, once they get out of school, men are much more likely to suffer homelessness, drug addiction, of course, crime. Both victims and perpetrators of crime, 90-some% of people in prison are male. And even unemployment, they don't count as unemployment anymore because so many men have stopped looking for work. And that's where they get the stats. So they had to dig deeper, and they call it male workforce participation. And what they're saying is it's at Great Depression era levels. That was a shock. Male workforce participation is as low today as it was in the Great Depression. So I do think it's time for us to say, shouldn't we spend a little time having compassion on men and asking why it is that men are doing so poorly? And suicide rates. I didn't mention that one, but that was one of the worst ones. The greatest cause of death in young men under 50 is suicide. So deaths of despair in many cases. So that alone should make us say it's time to spend some time building up men and asking how we can support men better. The reason girls got ahead in school was because we helped them. A massive amount of money went into creating girl-friendly curriculum and Title IX, and the federal government put money into training and workshops. So, by the way, back then they thought they would just bring girls up to where boys were. They had no idea the girls would shoot right past. But that's what's happened. And
Right.
so it's time to say, well, maybe boys would also respond well if we had some programs that were tailored more to their unique learning style, their unique personality, and so on. So I would start with that by just saying, we just out of simple, ordinary human compassion, we should ask why men are doing so poorly today and what we can do to help them.
And I think you talk about the role of a father as well. What are some practical steps that you think would be very applicable, just to tell men, hey, this is what you need to do to engage and connect with your sons and your daughters more?
Yeah, let me answer with another study.
Yeah.
So this was the study, one of the largest studies ever on how parents can pass along successfully their religious and moral convictions. 35-year longitudinal study. It won all kinds of awards. And it found two surprising results. The first one is that fathers matter more than mothers.
Yeah.
In other words, if a father goes to church and is a committed Christian, the children are my memory is 68% more likely. The children are more likely to follow him. Whereas with mothers, I don't have the numbers. It's lower. It's, maybe 50%, something like that. And so some mothers have an influence, but fathers have a greater influence. Whether they want to or not, they are going to influence their child. But secondly, the finding was that the quality of the relationship matters. If the father is a pillar of the church, a moral exemplar, has perfect theology, but the child perceives them as cold, distant, and authoritarian, he will not follow him in the faith. So it's very important that the father not only say, here's the right way to believe, do what I say. It has to be a loving relationship. And by the way, this was supported also by another study that was done on purely secular grounds of how to raise masculine sons. I thought this was fascinating. He also found, this researcher found that it again depends on the relationship. It doesn't matter how masculine the father is in a traditional stereotypical sense, whether he's the John Wayne type, or whether he's more gentle. What mattered was the quality of the relationship. Again, if the relationship was warm, close, and loving, the son would grow up with a secure, stable, healthy sense of masculinity. I thought that was great, seeing that coming from, a secular perspective, found exactly the same thing. So this is what I would do, is help men. Fathers often don't think they're that important. In fact, they've been told that. Margaret Mead was one of the most famous anthropologists, and she said, motherhood is natural to women. Fatherhood is a social construction. And so many men have felt like, well, fatherhood isn't really intrinsic to who I am. And by the way, that is now being debunked as well. They've been doing studies on the biochemical changes that happen in men when they become fathers. We always knew mothers, giving birth, oxytocin rises and helps them bond with their babies. Well, they started testing men, and men's oxytocin rises too when the baby's born. And by the way, it's triggered by tactile sense. So the father has to be actually holding and cuddling and playing with the baby for it to be triggered.
Okay.
And then the really surprising thing was, this is the most recent study. The father's oxytocin is rising through all 9 months of his wife's pregnancy. Nobody ever thought to check a man's blood.
No.
But when they did, clearly God has designed men for fatherhood all the way down to the biochemical level. They are being biochemically primed to be committed, loving, engaged fathers all through their wife's pregnancy and the birth of their child. So it's just as intrinsic to men. Parenthood is intrinsic to men in the same way that it is to motherhood.
Yeah, when I read that part, it was a surprise, but it was also not surprising at the same time. After being a father of 3 kids, it's like, oh yeah, absolutely. Like, my life changed. How I viewed life, everything shifted when I had kids and they entered into my world, because there was something inside of me that changed and shifted. I could go into scripture and all kinds of stuff and show you why, but I mean, it's again so nice to see the secular sciences supporting those things. Can we shift and pivot a little bit toward marriage, because I think there is this this struggle even within the church about authority and submission and what that looks like. You do talk in the book and elaborate for me about, I believe there was a study that showed that whether it was egalitarian or complementarian didn't actually matter when it came to the happiness. But would you elaborate more for me on that one?
Yeah, I have to tell you that that study was one of the main reasons the book it continued to be controversial even after it was published.
Right.
The day it came out, in fact,
Yeah.
I was swarmed on Twitter
Yeah.
by Christian egalitarians because
Shocking.
they thought I was being too positive towards traditional, more conservative, theologically conservative Christian men. Well, the thing is, that's who was studied. The people studied were the theologically conservative men because those were the ones being targeted.
Right.
So and they all overlooked that study that you just mentioned. In the book, I explain I'm following the data. I'm not really doing a theological study because there's plenty of theologians out there doing that. What I thought was unique and what most of us didn't know about is the studies being done. And one of the most surprising things is I said, I'm not going to even deal with complementarian versus egalitarian because two of the top researchers, like you said, both said it didn't matter. The first one was Brad Wilcox, that's a sociologist we've already talked about, who's considered, the top marriage sociologist in the nation. And he said, a wife's happiness does not depend on her husband's gender theory. That's how he put it. We have, because we have studied both complementarian and egalitarian couples. And, you might expect egalitarian couples to be happier, but he said they weren't. They weren't any happier. That's just what we found in studying them. And then the other one was the top marriage psychologist in the country, who's not a Christian, and who John Gottman is his name. So some of your listeners may actually know him. Yeah. But John Gottman said, okay, in our practice, we get people who believe the men should be in charge, and we have more egalitarian couples. And he said, and this is how he put it, we found that emotionally intelligent husbands know the most important thing, which is how to show honor and respect to your wife. And so I had these two top researchers saying that the gender theory doesn't seem to make much difference. And then I have a whole chapter on studies of evangelical couples. And again, some people say, well, we don't want to know that. We want to know what the theologians say. Yeah, but I want to know what it looks like in real life. I wanted to know, how do these ideas of headship and submission play out in real life? And, Tony, I was blown away. I did not expect evangelicals to test out being so happy, so loving, so respectful, so mutually supportive. But what I did is this is chapter 3 in the book. I took several quotes from couples out of a variety of different studies that were done. I took the actual quotes. I wanted to give their actual words, and so many of them, again, no matter what their gender theory was, they have figured out how to show honor and respect to one another. And it's not just us claiming it, saying, if you follow the Bible, you'll have a happier marriage. Now you can show that the facts support that. They do, in fact, have better marriages and healthier and stronger.
And I think that's a great tip for marriages. Learn to show honor and respect at the end of the day. And if we could figure that piece out, I think all of our marriages could be stronger and much more vibrant. You talked toward the end of your book about the problem of abuse in Christian homes. How can churches help families who may be experiencing those things?
Yeah, since nominal Christians have the highest rate of abuse, I realized I couldn't ignore that question. It would look like I was brushing it under the carpet. And also, as you know, in the introduction, I explained that I grew up in a very abusive home. So it's something I've had to work through myself. My father was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they sometimes say, was it open hand or closed fist? And with my father, it was closed fist. It was punching. And so, so I was interviewed by one Christian psychologist who said, well, at least we know you're not writing from an ivory tower. You're writing from the trenches. You
Yeah.
coming up with a positive view of masculinity was not easy for
I
me.
understand. Yeah.
When I left home as a young adult, I veered off into very very strong feminism, read all the groundbreaking feminist books, and then after I became a Christian, I had to start rethinking the whole
Mm.
question. So I have two chapters at the end on abuse, and the good news is there are much better resources now than there used to be, even a few years ago. Only a few years ago, most books put the responsibility primarily on the wife. If you would just be more loving, if you would just be more forgiving, if you would just cook his favorite foods, if you would just love unconditionally. As one woman who had an abusive husband said, her pastor said, he will blossom into the man you want him to be. Well, that's just not human nature. We all know that if somebody is willing to be a bully, to hurt people to get what he wants, if you placate and appease them, they do not change. And so that's not any different in marriage. The biblical answer is Matthew 18. Matthew 18 says if somebody sins, you need to tell him he's sinning.
Yeah.
This is what he's doing is wrong. Loving confrontation. And it's Jesus speaking. As Jesus says in Matthew, if he doesn't listen to you, bring a few other witnesses. And if he doesn't listen to them, bring it to the church. There may be a place for church discipline then. And so the best books on the subject now by Christians are starting to say this. And what I did, Tony, I put all the best books that I could find in the footnotes because I wanted these two chapters to be a real resource for people who might be dealing with this issue. So if you are, it is really only the most recent books. So check out my endnotes for the really good resources on how to help abusive marriages, which is usually the wife is the victim. Not always, but usually.
It's so good, so good. I'm curious. How can women help men be the best version of manhood that they can be? I'm actually thinking through like the lens of a wife who, not an abusive relationship, but just how does she help support, encourage, and empower her husband to be the biblical man that God has called him to be?
I think we all need to have a critical grid in place on what the secular world says, because we're all affected by it. It's like those teenage boys who are all fans of Andrew Tate.
Yeah.
The church has not given them a critical grid. And so they don't recognize the secular worldview when they meet it. And I think the same thing for both men and women is that, first of all, you have to start with the critical grid. Actually, let me give you one quote. This is one of my favorite quotes. If I want to tell people what the secular worldview is, let me pull it out and give it to you. In my book, I go through several stages of how the secular script developed, right, so that we can recognize it better. But one of my favorite stages is the rise of Darwinian evolution. And most of us think, well, that's just a scientific theory. But immediately, social Darwinists began to say that the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would be the ones who were ruthless, brutal, savage, barbarian, and predatory. Mm-hmm. And so, whereas in earlier age, men had been urged to live up to the image of God in them, the secular script began to tell men to live down to the supposed animal nature, the beast within, as they often said back then. And this is not just historical. There's a current book that's bestseller called The Moral Animal. And he says, and listen to this, human males are by nature oppressive, possessive, flesh-obsessed pigs. Giving them advice on successful marriage is like offering Vikings a free booklet titled How Not to Pillage. And I thought, how can he get away with such a negative view of men? But this is sort of the manosphere view of masculinity, right? So this is the red pill. As our culture is hostile to a healthy masculinity, some men are going off to the other side. In fact, let me give you one more. This is a book called Men in Marriage. And it says, I'll read the exact words again. Men are by nature violent, sexually predatory, and irresponsible. Their deepest yearning is not for wife and family, but for the motorbike and the open road. The male group escape to a primal mode of predatory and immediate gratification. And I have
Oh.
Christian friends reading this book and say, yeah, it's a good book. And I have to tell them, no, this is where, you know, in standing over against the denigration of masculinity, we've often gone to the other extreme, and and we are liable to embrace sort of the Manosphere version, which is influenced by, well, Darwinism for one thing. And the Andrew Tate, by the way, also talks about, men like me who are more evolved.
Yeah.
He'll use that language of evolution too. So I think an important starter is to say we need to have a critical grid so that we are not influenced by the secular world, either on either side, right? On the progressive woke side or the red pill Manosphere side.
Right.
You almost have to clear your mind of this first before you can even read scripture with a clear mind and see what it says. And then, read the chapters on the sociological studies. Like I said, I was blown away. I was so encouraged. Having come from an abusive home, I was incredibly encouraged just to read that, hey, there really are Christians out there living God's word, and here's what it looks like. We hear sermons with the moral instruction, but what does it look like?
Yeah.
That helps a lot, so that we can ourselves, live out the Christian ethic.
It's so good. At 242, the church I lead, we are really big on next steps. So we always like to tell people, hey, what is your next step? If there was a next step that you would just say, hey, all men need to do this, what would that thing be?
I do think that standing against the secular view that your job is your identity. A lot of even Christian men sort of have that, where the family's kind of on the side, but they get their major fulfillment and identity from their jobs. And that is just has never been the case prior to the Industrial Revolution. That's another thing the past, history gives you an alternative so that you can think more freely about, how we are trapped in our own day, how we don't think outside the box of our own day. But the pandemic actually helped loosen that box because a lot of men did work from home. I have several anecdotes in the book on men who found ways to work from home during the pandemic. But this is a study that's not in the book because it was done later. Harvard University actually did a study. And here's the conclusion. The conclusion was this, word for word. During the pandemic, 68% of fathers said they got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that. They really would like to say, can't we challenge maybe the career-oriented ideal and say, men would prefer to have some sort of hybrid situation, have some more time to work from home, have flexible hours, maybe, ways where you could tweak the workplace to give fathers more time with their kids. They actually do like their kids, most of them. And they don't feel like they can ask for time at work because then they're seen as less committed. I interviewed one father who simply left work 2 days a week early to coach his son's basketball teams. And his boss accused him of coasting. It wasn't easy. He was not seen as, committed. And then he told me, but it did not, in fact, affect his job at all. And when his sons got older, they said, we want to be a dad like you.
Right.
Which is much better than any workplace praise.
Amen. There's a football player that I've followed anyway. He just retired mid-season, and one of the reasons he retired, the reason he gave for retiring, is that he had a season, a year off, and he got to connect with his kids differently. And he wants to invest in not only his relationship with God, but he wants to invest in his kids while he has the chance. So he's walking away from his football career so he can focus on his kids and being a father, which I think paints a beautiful picture of what you just said, is about just taking the time to prioritize and lean into it. And I think for many men who haven't taken the time to really invest in that area, they've missed out on a deep joy of being the father that God has allowed them to become. So when they begin to experience it, like really powerful things happen. Professor Pearcey, I'm so thankful for you. I'm curious though, before we go, is there anything that we didn't cover and talk about that you think, hey, we really need to mention this thing?
Well, I'll give you one more positive study. So this was an anthropologist, again, not a Christian, but it was the first ever cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. First ever.
Okay.
And of course, there were differences, but he found that all around the globe, everyone agreed on what it meant to be a good man. And he called it the 3 Ps. A good man will provide, protect, and procreate, meaning become a father.
Yeah.
Build into the next generation. And I thought, there it is again, that, despite everything negative that we hear about masculinity today, we need these studies that show men at heart innately do know what it means to be a good man, to provide, to protect, to procreate, to be an involved father. It is so encouraging to me that men innately, intuitively know why God created them and that they should use those gifts for good.
That's so good. So good. Toxic Moral Masculinity. The link to, I assume it's available where all booksellers are. Amazon is a place you can get this book. We'll have a link in the description of this video. Again, Nancy, thank you. This has been my favorite book I've read in quite some time. Just the way you did it was masterful, and it's just such really, really good information. So you've written a book called Love Thy Body. You've written Toxic Moral Masculinity. What controversial subject are you doing next?
Oh, good question. I would like to take on politics.
Yeah.
Politics is so interesting today because we've got this tension between globalism, global institutions, multinational corporations and so on that want to get rid of national boundaries, get rid of individual countries. And then we have sort of resurgent populism that says, no, wait a minute, countries are good. And I do think that the greatest threat to religious liberty will be globalism. And I think Revelation says that in the book of Revelation in the Bible, says that there will be suggests a single one world government that will have a lot of power. And so I think it's perhaps one of the things Christians should be thinking about now, not later, now, on how will we respond to or resist, a global power.
Yeah. Well, you've endured 2 tough topics. I think you can endure another one. You've got it. So when that book comes out, I will be one of the first people to buy it.
And if you want to see what other tough topics I've covered, let me tell people about my website.
Yeah.
It's the nancypearcey.com. And so Pearcey is Pearcey.
Yeah.
Get that extra E in. nancypearcey.com. And there you can browse my other books as well.
Absolutely. And we'll have that in the description.
And you can say hello. That would be fun.
Yeah. We'll have that. Any other way they can connect with you, Nancy?
Well, I am pretty active on Twitter and Facebook. So yeah, that would be fun as well to interact online.
Fantastic. Well, Professor Pearcey, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. And thank you for the content in the book, because I do think it will change and transform many people. Thank you so much for being with us.